All right, so today we're going to talk about SOC engagements. We are not going to assign a one person to be the captain of all discussion, unfortunately. So I'm sorry, Tyler. I know that you were looking forward to that. Somebody's going to look back on this and ask, what the heck was he about? Context, it's all context dependent. Just as a reminder, we have your next Excel assignment is due on Friday, along with your data analytics assignment. So very first part, your data semester research project deliverable. That's what I'm trying to say. So deliverable one's done. Hopefully you've started working on that. If you've not started working on that, you've got about 48 hours to get something pretty darn impressive down on paper. But looks like most everybody's gotten some work to move forward on that. As far as today's discussion, so we've talked about SOC reports in other classes. I alluded to it back in 367 for those of you who had me back then. And then we have talked about it also with respect to auditing, and it was alluded to back then. But SOC is becoming much more prominent and much more broad, and it's something that you're going to encounter. It's very interesting because 2 years ago, this is one of those topics that every single one of our partners was just talking about. We need more education in this area, need more education on SOC. And there's actually a lot of resources out there now. My initial problem with SOC reporting and trying to teach about SOC reports is that all the information that the firms had was proprietary. So I was basically begging firms to send me example SOC reports so that I could teach these in classes. And they say, we'll get those to you, and then never would. Now we actually have those, but firms are just kind of like saying SOC report, that was so 2 years ago. We're not now worried about cybersecurity and AI. So is this still an important and prominent topic area? Absolutely. In fact, cybersecurity is one of the topic areas we're going to talk about today. I do think that's kind of been overshadowed, but it is still one of those things that every single person in this room, not just the auditors, okay, every single person in this room is going to encounter with respect to their careers moving forward, simply because you all are going to be working with businesses who will be working with other businesses. And it's going to have a big reflection on some of the tasks and some of the concerns that you'll have moving forward in operating with other organizations. So let's just go ahead and we're going to start out with some very basic questions, and then we'll move forward to the more difficult ones. So remember, SOC reports or SOC examinations, they used to be called Service Organization Control Examinations. Now they're System and Organization Control Examinations. But they kind of follow the same protocol. It has to do with something that's very needed when organizations work with other organizations. So at the very basis, let's talk about what exactly it is that a SOC examination does. And Holden, I can see you're really excited over there. You got the answer over there, but I feel like I always go in that order, so I'm going to reverse it up. I'm going to start with Team 7 and move backwards. Okay, so Olivia. Okay, Olivia, in your own words or your group's own words, what is the purpose of a SOC examination?
My group's own words said that it provides assurance about an organization's internal controls or cybersecurity. That they're generally obtained by third-party service organizations to provide assurance to their customers about their internal controls.
All right, so third parties provide information about their controls to their customers. Now, why is that such an important characteristic? Why is that such an important aspect? And it has to go back with the nature of business expansion that's occurred. I'd say it's probably been a pretty long time, because say the past half century, although it's become increasingly more prominent over the past few decades. As we've seen businesses grow, a lot of businesses, particularly smaller businesses that are in bigger markets, have found is that they may not be well set up to do everything that they need to do themselves. And that's actually it's a pretty straightforward consideration if we think about our own operations. So think about what you do from day to day. How many of the things that you do are you self-sufficient on? Can you do on your own? Like, for example, we're sitting here in the classroom where you guys are taking notes and you all are getting an education. Is this entirely self-sufficient? Did you go out and find the books on your own? Did you buy the computer? Did you purchase the internet access? Or are you, sorry, I should say, are you providing your own internet access? Answer is no. Some of these you could probably acquire on your own, but for the most part, you're utilizing other people's work or other people's technology. And that's kind of a trend that we've seen as we've grown as a society, is that there's been an integration of all of our interdependencies on one another. This is common at the business level. Businesses have identified there are certain strengths that we have there are certain weaknesses that we don't have. We could either try to address those weaknesses ourselves, or we could hire other organizations to meet those needs for us. Now, if we were to go back, say, 30 to 50 years ago, one area that was really prominent and still an example of SOC reporting today is, first of all, SOC reports didn't exist 30 years ago, but this is kind of just an anecdotal example. Example of this, the need that was met by outside organizations is payroll processing. So a lot of organizations found that they had to actually have certain staff and certain infrastructure in place in order to provide payroll services for their employees, because employees do like to get money. That's just one of the natures of being hired in an organization. If you're one of those people who's just kind of like, I'm not in it for the money, I'm in it for the work experience, I think you'll probably get a high demand of people who will want to hire you. But I would say that you're probably more valuable than that. So payroll processing, really important. And organizations said, if we could just hire an outside organization that could do the work for us, we could focus on our core competencies. That's kind of one of the catchwords. And so a lot of these payroll organizations spouted up. ADP is one of the most popular ones that's heard of, and they're a payroll outsourcing service. Now, that is all good and well, but think about what happens when you have somebody outsource the work for you. They have become part of your information system. In order to be able to provide those services, they've got to know details about intricate matters, proprietary matters within your organization in order to be able to provide those services. So as part of that, since they're part of the information system, they are now part of the controls infrastructure. And that means that there's a bigger concern now. Instead of having to worry just about your own internal controls and your own operations, you've got to worry about the infrastructure that's in place in other organizations as well. So how do we bypass that issue? Well, recently we've started saying we need to have some assurance with regard to types of controls that are in place at these service organizations or these companies that provide these outsourced services. And this is becoming increasingly more pronounced over time because we've started seeing a lot more services that are becoming integrated. My favorite example, the one that I don't think it's used very much, but I think that it's pretty much impossible today for most organizations to operate without internet infrastructure. I mean, imagine, I'm trying to think, is there a company in this world that you can think of that's moderately sized? I know you might point at Greek Corner Euros, my it's just like, yeah, they don't use the internet in any of their operations. They do have a Facebook page though, just so you know, okay? But they don't use the internet infrastructure for the most part of operations. But that's a really extreme example. Could a reasonable company operate without having some sort of a network to support their operations? I mean, think about what that would entail if you don't have a network that all your computers are on a shared network together. If you want to share information, you basically said, okay, put it on the jump drive, back it up, go walk it over to the office, and then give it to my coworker. That's basically what we had to do back in the 1980s. You know, we got a lot more exercise in the office because we were up and walking with information. Back then it was on floppy disks and diskettes, but I talked about like in the 1980s like I was doing. That's even a little old for me. So anyway, long story short, because we have this infrastructure that's necessary for most of these organizations, now the internet service provider is a part of the organization system. And so we need to make sure not only are our controls strong, but their controls are strong as well. And so that kind of belies the reason for the need for the service organization or system and organization controls examinations. So that's kind of what we talked about back in 417, and that was the starting point. Hopefully you all had a pretty solid understanding of that already, because the next point is to talk about, all right, what are the nuts and bolts? What are the details of these examinations? So those of you who did SOC reporting for your 417 project, you probably have a little bit of a jump start on this, but I want everybody to be at the same level. So let's get everybody up to the same level. So the next question is, who is authorized to conduct a SOC examination? Sydney, what's your group say on this one? CPAs, okay? Not auditors, CPAs, all right? So if we talk about the nature of assurance, we talk about the nature of provision, it's not going to be an audit service. It's actually considered to be a general assurance service. And even though some of these are going to be closely tied to audit, particularly one of the SOC reports, you're going to say it's used almost exclusively in financial statement audits. This is not something that's audit exclusive as a whole, especially since four of the 5 types of reports are not even audit specific. So what are the general characteristics of organizations that engage in these SOC examinations? You only had to say 3 letters that last time, so I'm going to hit you again, Sydney. So what's the next one?
That they're service organizations.
Yeah, service organizations. So what does that mean? What is that context for that?
The company is utilizing their services, their
Yeah. It's kind of a reiteration of what we were just talking about. Yeah, so anybody who's going to actually provide or take part in a SOC examination or issue a SOC report, these are organizations that provide services to other organizations, and specifically services that integrate with the other existing organization's infrastructure. Now, that's kind of an important distinction because if they're part of the information system, then they can have an effect on the controls. In fact, we are going to see a practical example of this. We're going to talk about the target data breach in a few weeks. And the target data breach, where that operation came from is that they had a vendor who was not really up to date on their controls protocol, their virus protection, their malware protection. And even though Target actually had a pretty strong control system, the fact that their vendor, who had access to their information system, didn't, they actually were able to, the attacker was able to actually access through the vendor's protocols and then access the entire target infrastructure, which is kind of a practical example of why this controls process is so important, why this reporting process is so critical. All right, so what is it that actually drives the decision? Well, basically, the decision to have a SOC examination performed is usually driven by requests or requirements or a SOC report from the service organization's customers. So most likely, you'll know if you need a SOC report because your customers are asking for one, all right? So if you're saying, all right, I'm not sure if I need to have a SOC examination, if I need to issue a SOC report, that's actually driven by the customers that are of the organization. So something like ADP or something like an internet service provider, they pretty much have gotten to the point where they're routinely providing these SOC reports. But it's going to be, if you're a new organization and you're not sure if that's the case, then that's going to be the key figure. That was, I think, a quote from the Warren Abbott article. A little bit further on, so what is the typical timeline for completion of a SOC examination? So let's see. John, what did your group say?
3 to 6 months, maybe a little longer, depending on the type of SOC report.
Yeah, and so hopefully it's going to be a shorter period of time, but in the article they basically said that it can be a lengthy process, sometimes taking several months, as John alluded to, sometimes even a year to complete, depending on how prepared the organization is to meet the requirements. Now that kind of leads to a tricky question, is like, what dictates that level of preparation? And that's an important question that we're not going to answer just yet. We're going to actually talk about that question a little bit later on. But I want to actually set the stage for that because that actually leads into one of our final questions here. All right, so SOC report, SOC examination is generally good, but what's the difference? We got 5 types of reports, okay? 5 types of reports we talk about. First 3 are going to be kind of distinct from the others, but let's talk about the first 3 and get into a little bit of detail on that. So 3 primary category SOC reports that can be issued in conjunction with SOC engagements: SOC 1, SOC 2, and 3. Now, again, this is ignoring the kind of specialized SOC reports, which we're going to get to discuss here in just a little bit. But I want to get a brief discussion of the difference. Okay, so Colin, I'm not going to make you responsible for all 3 of these. I'm going to make you responsible for one of them. And you know what? Because I'm feeling generous, I'm going to let you choose. Do you want to describe SOC 1, SOC 2, or SOC 3?
SOC 1.
SOC 1. All right. All right. So SOC 1. What is a SOC 1 report? Okay. So we've heard that term before. Where have we heard internal controls over financial reporting? ICFR. Those letters sound really familiar. Like I know it, Dr. Barnes, on the tip of my tongue. It's like it's another course that you've taught. I've taught every course, so you can't have to be more specific. So which course are we talking about here? Yes, tax. Yeah, it's the tax course I taught. Yeah. Start. Yeah. All right. So obviously we're talking about auditing. All right. And that was chapter 7 in auditing. We talked about why is internal control so important with respect to reporting. Well, remember that we're concerned about financial reporting as auditors, making sure the financial reports are free from material misstatement. Blah, 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 financial statements are. So we're going to be concerned about the controls in that area. So that's ICFR. So SOC 1 specifically refers to controls in this area. If we think about controls that might actually affect financial reporting within an organization, even if they're outsourced controls, the auditor has a responsibility to gain assurance of that. So what would be the best possible solution? Well, the auditor has so much time and so much resources, they can go to the service organization and they can audit the controls themselves. The question is that a practical solution? This is an easy question, guys. The answer is no. Okay, hopefully everybody's saying it. Because like, I'm not sure, I wasn't paying attention to the question. I'm just gonna go like this a little bit. Yeah, all right. So the answer is no, it's not a practical solution for the auditor to go to a service organization and perform that audit of controls. So what's a more reasonable solution? Well, presumably, these organizations that provide these services, these service organizations, and that provide the infrastructure, they have their own auditors, which we can actually refer to them as service auditors. And the service auditors can issue a report saying, look, we have audited this company. We have tested their controls. Their controls are strong. Their controls are good. All right. So that's the SOC 1 report. Now, that was all we talked about back in 417. Now, we talked about SOC reporting. We said SOC 1. SOC 1 was really, really important for auditing because it dealt specifically with a really important audit topic area, ICFR. But we've got two others that are kind of related, but a little bit different in their focus. Okay, so, real quick, when we talk about SOC 1 reports, okay, they have a financial statement focus. They're related to internal controller financial reporting. What is their distribution? So we could actually say distribution could be one of two things. It could be general or restricted. So if it's general, it means everybody can access it, can look at it. If it's restricted, it means that only people who are authorized to actually access the information or who are authorized to look at the information can view it. What do you think SOC 1 is? I'll give you a hint. It's one of the big reasons why I'm having so much trouble finding example SOC reports for you guys. Restricted. It's very restricted. Okay, it's restricted in use. It is considered proprietary detail. We got two more. So I asked Colin, and Colin took one of the options away from you, Lotus. So you got SOC 2 or SOC 3?
SOC 2.
Okay, what is SOC 2 report?
SOC 2 report is more over internal controls, it covers controls over security.
Right. Okay. So we talk about SOC 2. We're talking about a lot of heavily focused on privacy and controls in that area. The term that's used quite frequently in the Warren Abbott article, and the word term that I think is very easy to pick up on, is called trust services. So individuals who are utilizing those services have trust that those services are secure. Okay. Now, when we talk about SOC 1, I said SOC 1 has a financial focus. SOC 2, on the other hand, tends to be more of a technical focus. We think about what that means from a controls perspective. Go back to their controls hierarchy, or I should say, our controls breakdown from COSO. We said COSO has 3 objectives. All right, so there's reporting, there's operations, and there's compliance. We're talking about SOC 1. SOC 1 is very heavily focused on that reporting aspect, whereas SOC 2 is going to be more focused on compliance and operations, making sure that the technical aspects of the organizations are being met and that they can be relied upon. So that's kind of the distinction we make with respect to SOC 2, is that they have a different focus in that area. What about the distribution of the report? What do you guys think? Do you think that one's general or restricted? Restricted. That's an important distinction because we need to compare that to SOC 3. Because now we have SOC 3. And Jenna, what is SOC 3?
You said that it also reports on like trust services, but it's a lot more general and has a lot less detail.
Yes. So it is less detailed. Okay. It does tend to be focused on trust services. So it's very much like a SOC 2 report, but what is the distribution of a SOC 3 report? It's general, yeah. So it's going to be anybody who wants to access that information has access to it. So it's basically trust services information for the people. Okay. And that's a snarky response, obviously, but you can actually find SOC 3 reporting if you go online. Has anybody ever actually gone to a website and seen like a little blue symbol in there that talks about trust service criteria or trust services? You can actually find that on secure websites. They'll actually talk about the trust services that are utilized. And so that's something to make sure we make a note of, is that it's not necessarily going to be as detailed as a SOC 2 report, but it is going to be more accessible than a SOC 2 report. So same focus, just not necessarily as detailed, and the distribution is different. Then the reason I make that distinction is that when we're trying to delineate SOC 2 and SOC 3, they basically have the same focus. They're both still technical focus concepts, but SOC 3 is going to be more broad in use, hence the reason why it's going to be less detailed and less restricted. All right, so important distinctions to make there. Now, going on to question 4, I was talking about type 1 versus type 2 reports, which is everything in accounting apparently gets broken down to type 1 and type 2. This is the problem with us not having creativity in Bloom's taxonomy in accounting. We are prohibited from being creative as accountants. So basically, anytime we categorize something, we categorize it as type 1 or type 2, and everything is categorized that way, it seems. okay? But specifically with respect to SOC type reporting, SOC type 1, type 2, they have to issue those types of reports. So we need to understand the difference between type 1 and type 2 report. Now, it's important to note with respect to this, SOC 3 reports are always type 1. SOC 3 reports are always type 1 in nature. That's why I didn't list them here. So, and that's going to be a kind of important lead into the difference between what SOC 1, type 1 and type 2 are. All right, Holden, I held you up long enough. Oh, by the way, I noticed the arm is moving. How are you feeling? Good. All right, fantastic. All right.
Type one's for a specific point in time, talking about the design of the control. And
Good.
Type two is over here.
Okay, so two important criteria, two important differentiations when we talk about type 1 versus type 2, okay? A type 1 report is going to be relating just to the design of controls in place, okay? Just the design of controls in place. And it's only going to look at a specific point in time. So if we were to actually say, what would a SOC 1 or SOC 2 type 1 report look like? The service auditor providing that report say, we have evaluated the design of controls in place of the organization as of December 31st, 2024. So they're going to say, we've evaluated design, what has been created, okay? What has been created. And then they're going to evaluate what it is at that period, or sorry, that specific date, all right? Distinction, when we talk about type 2 is more far reaching. Type 2 is going to be a lot more detailed. It talks not just about design, but also operating effectiveness. So think about it this way. We talked about back to this in 417, and yes, I know I'm talking about specific auditing concepts here, but this is something we've talked about already. We talked about the nature of controls. I said there's two ways controls fail. Controls can be designed improperly, which means that they're either not in place or they are in place, but they're not addressing the particular issue that needs to be addressed, or they're not operating effectively. You've got segregation and duties in place, but it's being ignored. Okay, which one is going to be more? Detailed in coverage? Is it going to be type 1 or type 2? Type 2, because type 2 is addressing not just the concern of whether the controls are designed correctly, but whether they actually work, whether they're actually working properly. Okay. So, and then also another distinction to make, type 2 says that it's going to cover a period of time. Not just going to be for as of a date, but for as a period. Usually it's going to be for a period of months, although you can be for a longer period of time, depending on how long the engagement takes. Okay, so moving on, SOC 2 and SOC 3 both deal with trust services. What are trust services? So I'm going to go back to Olivia again. So we have this term trust services. What does this mean?
We said that it is a service organization that a company like to provide services.
Okay. So service organization provides services to its customers or to its clientele. Customers is kind of a broad term because we actually say customers. It's possible that we could have trust services for people who are not direct customers but are still stakeholders with the organization. Okay. So what are trust services? Trust services are basically saying, look, you can trust our infrastructure. You can trust the controls that are in place. It's kind of silly to use that as the definition, but that's the best way to think about it. Is that it's some sort of attestation being made that our infrastructure is reliable, that it's worthwhile to consider. All right. So why are SOC examinations in this area necessary? Sydney, what's your group say?
They're important in order to provide assurance to the parties over the design. That's basically just saying.
Yeah. So basically, they provide design assurance design and for type 2 reports effectiveness. So basically, we're trying to provide some sort of information for people who are going to be utilizing these services for them to understand whether or not they can be relied upon, whether they can be useful. I mean, if you think about it, just think about this naturally. If you were to try, what would be a good example of this? I'm going to say, all right, so let's say that you're going to have your cookout because everything in my classes revolves back to food. Okay, all right. You have your cookout and you're going to buy some charcoal, and you buy some charcoal and you put it in the grill and it says. And you try to light it and you use a ton of lighter fluid and the charcoal will not catch for some reason, and you take it back to the store and say, this charcoal doesn't work. Says, oh yeah, we never said the charcoal would actually work. Okay. You probably would say that kind of defeats the whole purpose of having the charcoal in the first place. Okay. I don't know why I use charcoal for that analogy. That was right off the top of my head, guys, by the way. Okay. So, at least I wasn't talking about cheeseburgers, but maybe we'll get to that. Who knows? So yeah, we want to make sure that whenever something's being used for an intended purpose, that we can actually rely on it for that intended purpose. We also know that it goes well beyond that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail next week. We're concerned about the nature of information that's going to be shared. Something that's was easily exploitable back in the days, early days of network operations, is that information that got shared got captured, and you weren't aware of it being captured. Nowadays, you go to a new website, oftentimes they have a little message that appears at the bottom. It says, by visiting this website, you are acknowledging that we may capture use for future or information for future use. Sometimes you can opt out of that information being shared. There are cookies. We've talked about that already in class. You can actually dictate that. Sometimes organizations will not give you that information. They'll say, all right, you visited the website. We're taking all the detail that you provide for us. So that's obviously a very big concern as well. And we want to know the breadth of the operations. So it's a much bigger issue that we can go into a lot of more detail with respect to that, which we will do next week. So what is the difference between the scope of SOC 2 and SOC 3 with respect to these trust service reporting on trust services? We've already talked about that to some degree, because we've already talked about the nature of SOC 2 being more focused on organizational tasks or sharing with management or people with the stakeholders in the organizations, or specific stakeholders in the organizations. The fact that a SOC 2 report can also be a type 2 report tells you that it can be more detailed and more rigorous, whereas SOC 3 is very superficial. Not to say it's not useful, but think about the general audience, the broad audience out there. How many people out there do you think are going to go through and read through a detailed SOC 2 report to make sure that their information is secure? I mean, people in this day and age, my day and age too, have very short attention spans. So a SOC 2 report is probably not something that provides meaningful additional detail. So that's why SOC 3 reports are specifically supposed to be less focused and less better used in scope. All right, then we have two newer variants. Okay, so what are the two newer variants? So let's talk about one of each of these in turn. John, what's one of the variants that's new?
Sorry, I lost my computer down. What question is this?
Okay, question number 6.
Cybersecurity and supply chain technological advancements have created a purpose for these new SOC regions.
Okay, so you spoiled it because I was going to ask Colin what the other one was, but I mean, I guess that's obviously not a loss, because he's sitting right next to you, so he probably knew it as well. So, all right, would you agree with those, Colin?
I would agree.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So supply chain and cybersecurity and supply chain. Now, what is the whole point of these and why were they developed? Now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the aspects of this. Obviously, cybersecurity isn't sound. It was to address cybersecurity threats that started burgeoning in the middle of the 2010s, becoming really more prominent, and have only increased in scope over time. Did anybody catch what the date of implementation for SOC for cybersecurity was? So that was in April of 2017. Okay, April of 2017. So they were starting to find out in the middle of the 2010s that this is becoming an increasingly problematic issue and needs to be addressed in many organizations, particularly with respect to the safety and protocol with respect to how information is protected and secured within organizations. The SOC for cybersecurity, what do you guys think? What is it, a general use or a restricted report? It's a general, yeah, good job. Yeah, because that's going to be something that applies to a very wide, broad array of stakeholders. So we want to make sure that they have information in that area. So SOC for cybersecurity is specifically addressing cybersecurity concerns that are in place or becoming more prominent. Then we have SOC for supply chain. SOC for supply chain is a very new one. And, that's a relative term, I suppose, because I tend to think anything that happened over the past 10 years to be new. But, I also realize that if I talk about 10 years, you guys were still in middle school. So that's context dependent. That's really sobering. I started at Truman State, you all are in middle school. Really weird. Yeah, all right. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to get lost on that train of thought. So it was in May of 2020 when this was passed. And I would say that was actually pretty fortuitous because there was something really important about supply chains that occurred right around that time period. Does anybody know why we had a massive supply chain disruption, global supply chain disruption in that period of time during spring of 2020? Does anybody know why that was? That was the pandemic. Yes, it was the pandemic, had a massive disruption, which actually highlighted the importance of this area. This is something, interesting discussion. So I used to teach 221. I think there's a few people in the class who took me for 221, but yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that I used to do is I used to actually have a sit down with my brother, who at the time was a general manager for the Raising Cane's Corporation. He had a lot to do with logistics. And during the pandemic, we had a YouTube call, or call that it was a Zoom call that I posted to YouTube for my class to watch. And we were talking about the logistics of that, and I was saying, yeah, this seems kind of really problematic. It seems like that since supply chains are down, that you guys are going to have massive disruptions, and it's going to be you're going to either see the inability to provide services, or the suppliers who provide it are going to gouge their prices because it's going to go up. And he was just kind of like, well, we're so diversified that it doesn't really matter, that we've got so many different areas and different places that we can get products from, that this is never going to be a disruption problem for an organization of this size. All right. Who do you think was right in the long run? Do you think it was him, or do you think it was me? It was, well, I'm the professor, so obviously I'm right. Okay. This is one of the few things when we talk about logistics that I get to crow over him. And actually, whenever I record a video, and I'm going to do it again, I'm going to send him a clip from this. Okay. Remind him about this one prescience that I had. Yeah, because we were talking about supply chains. And I said, yeah, it just seems like that organizations like this, they're going to experience massive disruptions, and it's going to trickle onto the consumers. And if you paid attention to Raising Cane's prices right around that time, it's exactly what happened. Interestingly enough, the price effects that you all experienced were not even the full price effects. Like that, it was something like a 50% increase in the supply of chicken tender, or price of chicken tenders right at that time. And I think the price effects were something like 15%. So they actually absorbed 35% of themselves, which if you know anything about operating a business, when you have cost increase in one area, you have to decrease costs in other areas, which is not a happy policy to have to enact. So that's going well beyond the scope of this whole discussion that we're supposed to have here. But I think it's very interesting that we are only kind of really understanding the necessity of supply chains and how they impact our organizations. So logically speaking, does the vertical integration of an organization's operations, does that affect the operations? And the answer should be, well, obviously, yes. Okay. If supply chain at any point in the cycle is disrupted, it's going to affect everything else that's downwind of that cycle. And this is something that we experienced acutely during the pandemic. But it's still very prominent today, especially as we start seeing shortages in labor and shortages of supply. We're starting to understand that there needs to be diversification across the supply chain. So the practical example, and again, I apologize going back to 417, but this is the example that I'm familiar with. Remember, Earthware Clothiers, our example from that particular course. And we said they've got a wide array of suppliers. They had like 300 suppliers when we talked about them back in 417. But 2 of their suppliers are responsible for 40% of their merchandise purchases. So can we say that their operations were diversified? The answer is yes and no. Because on one hand, if either of those other suppliers, those 2 suppliers, the primary ones, were disrupted, they probably had backup suppliers. But what were the implications for that in the long term? If you have a reliable supplier that goes away, you're probably going to have to rely a lot more heavily on other suppliers, and the costs may increase pretty substantially. That being said, you can still provide operations. So that there was both a happy and a sad conclusion in that scenario. And that's kind of what we have to consider with respect to SOC supply chain, is that we need to have contingency plans in place for things like that in the future. Now, to be fair, I don't know that we could ever plan for a global pandemic again. I think that's probably outside of the scope of most organizations planning, but the necessity of supply chain management, supply chain understanding became really important. By the way, are we doing global supply chain management? It's not this semester, it's next semester, right? Or is there a supply chain class this semester? No, okay, nobody's taking it. So that's one that a lot of graduate students take. It's very interesting because I talked about that class. That was actually the first graduate class when I started my master's program at OU. To this day, the exam I took in this class was only eclipsed in difficulty by one other exam, and that was the CPA exam, okay? I will tell you right now that if you do take global supply chain management, it was not my experience. Mine was actually a brand new PhD who was trying to prove that he was rigorous. So he gave us an exam. It was 200 points an exam. I got 40 out of 200, okay? And I'm not a dumb person, by the way. I felt dumb that day, but I'm not dumb. So supply chain can be very challenging, even though we simplify it here. All right. So according to the Warren Everett article, what are the 4 steps in conducting a SOC engagement? How does this compare to the process of controls testing, IT or otherwise? So let's just go ahead and take a look really quick at the Warren Everett article, because they actually have a breakdown of this. should have been ready, okay. So conducting a planning meeting, conducting a ready assessment, type 1 examination reporting, type 2 examination reporting. So I will say that 3 of these steps are fairly rudimentary. That if I were to ask you what were the steps in this, you probably could have come up with some representation of this. Conducting a planning meeting, that's just kind of planning, all right? That's pretty straightforward. We need to have a plan for how we're going to conduct the engagement. And then type 1 examination reporting, that's going to be for pretty much everybody because the type 1 report is going to be in place for every single type of SOC report. And then if necessary, if required, under the terms of the engagement, the type 2 examination reporting. So 3 of those are obvious, but this whole readiness assessment thing, all right? What does that relate to? What is the whole point of readiness assessment? Well, remember earlier on when we were talking, I believe it was John that I was asking. I apologize, it was Colin, but I was saying, how long is the engagement going to take? And said 3 to 6 months, sometimes up to a year. This is the point in time where we have to determine, is the infrastructure viable enough? Is the infrastructure viable enough in place in the organization that this is going to be a short-term engagement, this is going to be a long-term engagement? So the readiness assessment is actually the determination of what is the scope of the services that need to be provided to be able to ensure that we provide sufficient assurance over the SOC examination. So this is actually that point in time we determine the length of the examination is going to be. And again, it's not just going to be encompassed within a vacuum. It's not going to be, all right, 6 months, go, you have 6 months. This can actually expand or contract depending on the nature of the engagement. For the most part, this readiness assessment is the determination of that length of time that we talked about before. All right, well, I think that does it for SOC reporting. We've got our next Excel activity we're going to do on Friday. So, oh, and our next quiz. You got to get ready for that. All right. So next quiz will be over the first Excel assignment and the last 2 weeks of last 2 weeks of activities, since we didn't have an Excel or quiz last week. So I will see you all on Friday for that.
We had a quiz last Friday.
Yeah, we did, didn't we? What do you think about this? We didn't have quizzes. We're in week 5. I'm still in week 4. Okay, everybody. So, all right. So apologies. Let's go back. It'll be over Excel 2, and it will be just over this material. So, okay, my apologies. By the way, this is not as bad as some of my gaffes that have been. I'm still recording, by the way, so this is going to be on YouTube for history to see. But yeah, I apologize. Yeah, we did have a quiz next Friday. I just got mixed up. So it'll be over Excel 2, which is the budgeting stuff, and then this SOC reporting information. I think everything else is up to date. All right. Thank you for the reminder.